Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth installment in our Introduction to Marxism series. Today we're going to discuss what socialism and communism are and how they develop out of capitalism from a Marxist perspective. So I'm going to be basing this lesson on Lenin's book, The State and Revolution, especially chapter 5. Now, for those of you who don't know, Lenin was a very famous Marxist revolutionary from the early 20th century. He was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, which overthrew the Russian Tsar in the October Revolution, and he went on to found the USSR. Okay, so you might be wondering, why are we going to Lenin instead of Marx or Engels? Well, in The State and Revolution, Lenin heavily quotes from works of Marx and Engels while providing his own commentary and analysis. So I think it provides a good supplement to and consolidation of what Marx and Engels wrote about these topics, and their ideas are often scattered across several works, so you can go to one place to get, I think, a good analysis and synthesis of it. Okay, so as a recap, in the last lesson we explored the ideas of historical materialism, and we saw that Marx and Engels predicted that, eventually, capitalism will fall and the proletariat will rise to power and become the ruling class of society. Also, you should think back to the last couple of sentences from section 1 of the Communist Manifesto, where they write, quote, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable," unquote. Of course, that victory of the proletariat comes through the proletarian revolution. But okay, what happens after the proletarian revolution? Well, in the Critique of the Gotha program, which Lenin quotes from a lot in chapter 5, Marx lays out a vision which essentially looks something like this. So what exactly is going on in this diagram? Well, firstly, we have a proletarian revolution under capitalism, which overthrows capitalism, and the proletariat now becomes the ruling class of society. Then we enter a lower phase of communist society, which has just emerged from capitalism. Marx terms this the lower phase of communism, but nowadays we usually just call this socialism. And many important things have to happen under socialism, which I'll discuss in just a minute. But this socialist period essentially allows for the transition to the higher phase of communist society, or usually today we just call that communism or full communism. One important thing to keep in mind here is the dialectical method I mentioned in the last lesson. You should think about socialism, this transition period between capitalism and communism, as a process rather than a fixed thing in itself. Remember that according to dialectics, things are constantly in flux, so a socialist society will constantly be changing as it transitions to the higher phase of communism. Also, this is not necessarily a straight line progression as I've laid it out in the diagram. At various points there might be setbacks or adjustments that need to be made, of course based on political and economic conditions within a country or within the world at large. Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's look a bit closer at this transition period of socialism. Lenin quotes Marx as saying, quote, "Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." Unquote. So what is this dictatorship of the proletariat? Well, it sounds a bit scary, but it's not a literal dictatorship with, one person, a dictator, ruling the country. It's simply referring to the political dominance of one class. So we would say that capitalism could be described as a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie wields political power and the proletariat does not. And I think Lenin describes this undemocratic nature of capitalism very vividly. So I'd like to just read you a paragraph from The State and Revolution, where he says, quote, "In capitalist society, providing it develops under the most favorable conditions, we have a more or less complete democracy in the democratic republic. But this democracy is always hemmed in by the narrow limits set by capitalist exploitation, and consequently always remains, in effect, a democracy for the minority, only for the propertied classes, only for the rich. Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners. Owing to the conditions of capitalist exploitation, the modern wage slaves are so crushed by want and poverty that they cannot be bothered with democracy, cannot be bothered with politics. In the ordinary peaceful course of events, the majority of the population is debarred from participation in public and political life." Unquote. So a dictatorship of the proletariat exists when the state acts in the interest of the proletariat and the proletariat alone. And what's important to keep in mind here is that to Marxists, a state acts in the interest of a class. It is a tool which one class uses to repress another. Now, what does this repression look like under socialism? Well, the proletariat is repressing the bourgeoisie now, as opposed to capitalism where it's the other way around. And the proletariat is also liquidating them as a class. So that means it's the role of the proletariat to expropriate the property of the bourgeoisie, that is, the means of production, and bring it under collective ownership and control. Now, some people view this as state ownership, or mostly state ownership, while others prefer workers collectively running enterprises directly. For example, the Marxian economist Richard Wolff advocates for that in a sort of worker co-op system. And historically, some countries have had a mixture of both kinds of ownership. Now, of course, there's a second role for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by this proletarian state. The proletarian state also needs to suppress bourgeois resistance to the formation of socialism. Naturally, the bourgeoisie will do everything in its power to prevent the creation of a socialist country, right? Because it's directly opposed to their interest, obviously. And actually, they'll attempt to overthrow existing socialist governments. And we saw this play out in the 20th century in many actually existing socialist countries like the USSR, Vietnam, North Korea, and so on. Now, once the bourgeoisie has been eliminated, there are no more classes in society, which means the state is no longer necessary as a repressive force to subjugate one class. So Engels actually explains this at the end of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which we discussed in the last session. So he says, quote, "As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence, based upon our present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act, by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, this is at the same time its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes in one domain after another superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things, and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out." Now that last part about dying out is actually, for the most part, translated as withering away. So people usually talk about the withering away of the state. Now, there's one other interesting point that Marx makes about the socialist transition. He says that people should not be paid with money, but instead they receive a certificate for the amount of labor they did. And you can use this certificate to buy goods. So you get a certain amount of goods based on how much labor you do, right? And you have an equal right to the amount of goods equal to the amount of labor you did. And at first this seems rather fair, but in fact Marx says that this equal right is a form of bourgeois law, and it's a defect of the lower phase of communism. And he says this because all law essentially applies equal treatment to unequal individuals. So, for example, some people will be stronger or weaker, some will be more intelligent or less intelligent, more athletic, less athletic, and so on and so on. And this naturally impacts the amount and the kind of labor they can do, right? And furthermore, people also have different needs. So, for example, some people have disabilities or they have health issues, so they need more access to healthcare, right? Or they have children, so they need to have access to education, maybe a larger home or whatever, and so on and so on. So these people need differing amounts of goods as well. But socialist society, according to Marx, cannot yet fully address all these different issues. And as a side note, a common misinterpretation of Marxism is that it is about, quote, making everyone equal, unquote, or ensuring equality of outcome. And the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, pictured here on the left, has become famous for making this argument, for example, in his debate with the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. However, we see here that this is definitely mistaken because Marx is directly attacking this bourgeois idea of equality, and he is actually recognizing that there are inequalities and sort of natural hierarchies to some degree among people. And Zizek actually mentions this exact passage from the Critique of the Gotha program during this famous debate. And very interesting to me, at least, was that Lenin brought up contemporary economists, economists contemporary to Lenin, making similar arguments, as far back as 1917. So this sort of misrepresentation of Marxism is certainly nothing new, and it continues even into the present day. So that essentially rounds up the socialist transition, the lower phase of communism. So let's move on to the higher phase of communist society. Now the state has, quote, withered away, it has become superfluous in all or almost all areas, and certainly it no longer acts as a tool of class repression because there are also no more classes, right? And of course, we also no longer have money, as I mentioned earlier. But what about this problem of bourgeois law, which Marx said the lower phase could not overcome? Well, Marx writes that, quote, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and with it also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a livelihood, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have increased with the all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois law be left behind in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So what Marx is explaining here, as Lenin then proceeds to lay out, is that in order to reach the higher phase of communism, the productive forces have to be developed significantly, which will allow us to produce all the goods we need in society, while reducing the amount of necessary work. So we need to produce a superabundance of goods, which will allow us to move past this problem of bourgeois law. Then people in society can live on this principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And this sort of aphorism essentially means that people work to produce things for society, according to their ability, and they can take things in return according to their needs. And the point of the superabundance is, even if you take more than you need, it doesn't matter because there's more than enough for everyone, essentially. Now, as Lenin also explains, this implies a change in the social character of humanity, because we can't have the sort of selfish interests that are created by capitalism and bourgeois society, the idea of competing with each other and so on, if there's going to be no state and we're all working cooperatively. So he says it can only occur when, quote, people have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social intercourse, and when their labor has become so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. Okay, so finally, Lenin also brings up the important point that this is not something that you can merely introduce into society or impose on society. It has to develop out of the lower phase of communism. Now, lastly, I feel that I should mention that not all communists agree with this view of what socialism and communism actually are. The main other school of communism which still exists today is the anarchists. And anarchists are generally opposed to all forms of the state because they view it as hierarchical and oppressive. And, Marxists also eventually want to get rid of the state, so they generally agree with this. But anarchists don't think that the use of the state is necessary in order to reach communist society or the higher phase of communism. In fact, some anarchists would say that you don't need this socialist transition with the withering away of the state at all. So it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot of disagreement among different communist tendencies and the way they see things as playing out. That's all I'll say for now, so thank you for listening. We can now move on to discussion and Q&A.